mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Fear. The gospel passage we heard, our seventh lesson. This passage that our lectionary brings us on this first Sunday of Advent is brimming with fear. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming in the world. Fear can make us faint, can't it? It can also make us feel paralyzed, cynical, and unsympathetic. Fear is actually the greatest challenge for us as human beings in our world. Think about it. It's fear that causes us to assume that we won't have enough and to hoard. It's fear that drives wedges of distrust in our communities. Fear causes us to define ourselves and those around us, not by what we share, but by what makes us different. Fear creates an either-or and an us-them perspective that makes it nearly impossible to find common ground, let alone to see through a lens of love and compassion. This is why fear is mentioned so many times in scriptures. More than 100 times, well more than 100 times in the biblical narrative, an angel, priest, or prophet says, usually on behalf of God, "Be not afraid." Scholars suggest that Luke's gospel was written near the end of the first century, some 50 to 70 years after the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's 20 to 30 years after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and for all intents and purposes put an end to the world as Jews and the followers of Jesus had known it. This passage was likely written to reassure the followers of Jesus, to help them to find a way not to let fear make them feel faint or paralyzed or cynical or unsympathetic. In and amongst the words of fear and foreboding are these ones from Jesus. "Now when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." Jesus goes on to say, "Heaven and earth may pass away, but my words will not pass away." Jesus says, stand up and raise your heads. Stand, even though you are afraid, by trusting, by believing that my words will not pass away. Jesus' words will not pass away. What words? Look at where this text appears in Luke's Gospel. Not the first chapter, but the 21st. This is very close to Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection as told in the Gospel of Luke. If we look to the next chapters of Luke's Gospel, we find words like this. "This is my body given for you. This is my blood shed for you." These words are a promise of continued presence with the disciples and with us. And we find words like this. "Father, forgive them." This promise of forgiveness supports us in our weakness, in our fear. It helps us to stand in the present and walk into the future. And we find words like this. "Peace be with you." This is a promise that in the resurrection there is an end to death. There is a promise that love wins. This promise that love wins levels the ground. It steadies us in our fear. Jesus promises not to abandon the disciples, and he promises not to abandon us in the challenges and fear and trauma of this life. And this life will be full of those things. Paul Claudel says this: Jesus did not come to explain away suffering or to remove it. He came to fill it with his presence. That presence is love, it's compassion, it's empathy. Our invitation, our call as Christians, is to let ourselves be filled with that presence, to be filled with love and compassion and empathy for ourselves and for others, and to let those things shape and guide our way in the world. Our call is to be so filled with love and compassion and empathy that these things take up more room in our hearts and souls and minds than fear does. After the service this morning, we'll bless and dedicate our new signs on either side of the Bell Street door. We've affixed rainbow flags on those signs. This decision to do this came out of the reflection and work of the Widening Our Welcome task group, a group that came together after the workshop offered on Zoom by the Ottawa Senior Pride Network in June. These flags offer a loving signal to members of the LGBTQ2X community that St. Luke's doesn't operate out of fear. We don't operate with an us-them perspective. We don't double down on differences. These flags signal that we choose love, that we see love, and that we welcome all, without exception, into a community of love and care and compassion. Earlier this week, several of us from St. Luke's met with Somerset Ward City Councillor Catherine McKenney, as well as city staff responsible for outreach work and support on our streets, and with Ottawa Centre NPP Joel Harden. The discussion focused on the disconnection in this neighborhood. We talked about challenges with the drug supply and with erratic behavior that is taking up a lot of room around here. And we talked about a collective response, bringing together partners to take up more room with a positive presence out on these streets, to cultivate relationships of love and care and connection. It was a great meeting. We weren't meeting as Christians, but we had something important in common. Fear was not the driving force as we considered a collective response. The driving force was compassion for those who are struggling on our streets. It was love and care for everyone in this neighborhood, including this worshiping community here at St. Luke's. We left that meeting with promises that those with access to additional funding to direct toward this corner would look at how to do that. We left with a promise to meet again, and a promise that we'd look for ways to meet, to gather together as a neighborhood, a community, and a collective. 13th century Dominican Meister Eckhart wrote these words: "What good is it that Christ was born in a stable in Bethlehem over 2,000 years ago, if he is not also born in me?" Advent is a season of preparation. We wait, expect, anticipate God's incarnation in Jesus. This waiting and preparing and expecting, it's not for an event that will explain away or remove suffering. It's not for God to parachute in and save the day. We live in hope of the ultimate redemption in the world to come. But in the meantime, Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. So we prepare this season to invite God into our fear, into our challenges, into all our emotions. We invite God to be born, embodied in us, in our actions, each of us in our own way, in our own small corner of the world. This is expressed beautifully in a song that I have been listening to, which is a paraphrase of the words of Teresa of Avila. Christ has no body now but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he sees. Yours are the feet with which he walks. Yours are the hands with which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands. And those words of Paul Claudel again. Jesus did not come to explain away suffering or to remove it. He came to fill it with his presence. May this Advent season, as we prepare to celebrate God's incarnation, be a time when we are reminded that God is with us. God is with us in our fear, in our doubt, in our weakness, in our questions. God is with us, ready to fill us with love and compassion and empathy so that fear doesn't overwhelm us, so that we can stand up and raise our heads and be Christ's hands, feet, and eyes in this world. May it be so.